The Civil War is by far the most interesting battle that ever took place, in my opinion. Not only was it a fight amongst our own people, but my family has strong roots in the Civil War. Many generations back, one of my grandfathers was a general for the rebels. Ever since my father told me the stories that have been told to him, my interest sparked into deeper research. The Civil War was a battle among our own nation. The Civil War is the central event in America's historical consciousness. While the Revolution of 1776 through 1783 created the United States, the Civil War of 1861 to 1865 determined what kind of nation it would be. The war resolved two fundamental questions left unresolved by the Revolution: whether the United States was to be a dissolvable confederation of sovereign states or an indivisible nation with a sovereign national government, and whether this nation, born of a declaration that all men were created with an equal right to liberty, will continue to exist as the largest slave-holding country in the world. One of the first events to take place in the Civil War was when Abraham Lincoln, a known opponent of slavery, was elected president. The South Carolina legislature perceived the threat. Calling a state convention, the delegates voted to remove the state of South Carolina from the Union, known as the United States of America. The secession of South Carolina was followed by the secession of 6 more states: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, and the threat of the secession by 4 more: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. These 11 states eventually formed the Confederate States of America. Another event in 1861 was the attack on Fort Sumter. When President Lincoln planned to send supplies to Fort Sumter, he alerted the state in advance in an attempt to avoid hostilities. South Carolina, however, feared a trick. The commander of the fort, Robert Anderson, was asked to surrender immediately. Anderson offered to surrender, but only after he had exhausted his supplies. His offer was rejected, and on April 12th, the Civil War began, with shots fired on the fort. Fort Sumter was eventually surrendered to South Carolina. Furthermore, in 1862, President Lincoln takes action. On January 27th, President Lincoln issued a war order authorizing the Union to launch a unified aggressive action against the Confederacy. General McClellan ignored the order. In January of 1863, President Lincoln declared the Emancipation Proclamation. In an effort to place the slave-holding border states, Lincoln resisted the demands of radical Republicans for complete abolition. Yet some Union generals, such as General B.F. Butler, declared slaves escaping to their lines contraband of war, not to be returned to their masters. Other generals decreed that the slaves of men rebelling against the Union were to be considered free. Congress, too, had been moving forward to abolition. In 1861, Congress passed an act stating that all slaves employed against the Union were to be considered free. In 1862, another act stated that all slaves of men who supported the Confederacy were to be considered free. Lincoln, aware of the public's growing support of abolition, issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, declaring that all slaves in areas still in rebellion were, in the eyes of the federal government, free. Meanwhile, in 1864, the Republican Party nominated President Abraham Lincoln as its presidential candidate, and Andrew Johnson for vice president. The Democratic Party chose General George B. McClellan for president and George Pendleton for vice president. At one point, widespread war weariness in the North made a victory for Lincoln seem doubtful. In addition, Lincoln's veto of the Wade-Davis bill, requiring a majority of the electorate in each Confederate state to swear past and future loyalty to the Union before the state could officially be restored. It lost him the support of radical Republicans who thought Lincoln too lenient. However, Sherman's victory in Atlanta boosted Lincoln's popularity and helped him win re-election by a wide margin. In 1865, the Confederacy began to fall rapidly. Transportation problems and successful blockades caused several shortages of food and supplies in the South. Starving soldiers began to desert Lee's forces, and although President Jefferson Davis approved the arming of slaves as a means of augmenting the shrinking army, the measure was never put into effect. In April of 1865, the remaining soldiers and platoons began to fizzle out. Remaining Confederate troops were defeated between the end of April and the end of May. Jefferson Davis was captured in Georgia on May 10th. Although my home state lost the war, I cannot feel disappointed for all the good that has come from the Civil War. My grandfather and many others risked their lives to protect us, and they didn't even know us yet. A mass of Americans died in those 4 years, including our president. The history is rich and will be talked about and remembered forever. The citations. The first is www.memory.gov. The second is www.civilwar.com. The third is www.history.com/American Civil War.